And we are back with another episode of the Kyle Anslone Show. Joining me on today's program is another one of my fantastic colleagues at the Libertarian Institute. He is Jeremy R. Hammond, independent journalist and research fellow at the Libertarian Institute. He has written about a broad range of topics, including U.S. foreign policy, with a particular focus on Israel. He is the author of several books, including the one I could recommend, Obstacle to Peace, the U.S. Role in the Israel-Palestine Conflict. Jeremy, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Doing all right. It's an honor to be on your show. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course, you have put out some really, really good op-eds this year on the Israel-Palestine conflict, doing really important breakdowns. I know you have such an important grasp on the history of this topic, but you can also get into and break down the contemporary issues, what's going on, which is a lot of what I want to talk to you about on today's show. We have Israeli leaders making some very bold statements about annexing the West Bank, destroying Gaza. I want to know how far you think Netanyahu wants to push Israel's borders, and what the role the Americans are going to be here, especially as this relationship, at least the Americans' view of Israel, seems to be changing. So, starting off here, I have a clip I want to play of Netanyahu discussing annexing the West Bank. This is a AI-generated translation of the statement.
Today I visited Ofra, which is celebrating its jubilee, 50 years since the establishment of the settlement. 25 years ago, I planted a cedar tree here and promised to return on the day the settlement celebrates its jubilee. Today I returned. I stood here half a jubilee ago and said that we would do everything to ensure the continuation of our hold on the land of Israel, that we would prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state, and that we would thwart all attempts to uproot us from here. Blessed be God. What we promised, we fulfilled. It was not easy. We faced heavy pressures from within and without, from American administrations that tried to impose the establishment of a Palestinian state on us. Together we stood firm. Together we fulfilled the promise of the generations. The tree I planted then has grown and strengthened, just like our settlement. Deep roots in the homeland and treetops reaching for the skies. You, the people of Ofra, are the spearhead of our continued existence in the land of Israel.
So, Jeremy, my question to you is this, as Americans who watch the mainstream media, they hear Israel wants a two-state solution. They want to have a Palestinian state next door. And here you had the Israeli leader who's been effectively in control of Israel for like 2.5 decades now, saying that during his time in power, he's worked to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state. So what's the truth here? Has Israel worked to create a Palestine, or has this, what Netanyahu explained, really been the plan all along?
Yeah, the mainstream media have suffered 2 decades of cognitive dissonance over this. And you're right. I mean, I discussed that in my book, Obstacle to Peace, which was published in 2016, about how the media were reporting, that Israel wants the two-state solution, including under Netanyahu, which is ridiculous because he's always opposed the two-state solution quite explicitly. He's maintained a policy, prior to 10/7, the October 7th, 2023 attacks. He maintained a policy of utilizing Hamas as a strategic ally, specifically for the purpose of blocking any movement toward peace negotiations with the Palestinian leadership. So of course he is opposed to the two-state solution, always has been. And 2 weeks before 10/7, he was at the UN General Assembly holding up a map labeled the New Middle East, showing no occupied territories, showing no Palestinian state, of course, only the single state of Israel from the river to the sea. So this is the goal. It's always been the goal. And I don't, the media really are just what Americans are inundated with via government information and the mainstream media is essentially Zionist propaganda designed to manufacture consent for the longstanding U.S. policy of supporting Israel's crimes against the Palestinians, including its occupation, settlement, and apartheid regime, supporting, essentially denying the Palestinians their right of return ever since the ethnic cleansing in 1948, by which the state of Israel came into existence. We now see both bipartisan support, first Biden, and now Trump, supporting Israel's genocide in Gaza, notwithstanding meaningless rhetoric especially from the Biden administration. Trump has kind of dropped the rhetoric, but the Biden administration, was attempting to placate the American public with meaningless rhetoric about caring for the Palestinian civilian population. But I wrote an article for the Institute, exposing that and what a ridiculous farce that was. And it had all these PR hoaxes, essentially designed to try to persuade people that they're trying to do something for the civilian population. But the fact of the matter is that, Biden, Trump, if they wanted to end this, they could do it with a phone call. It'd be very simple. Instead of like the floating pier fiasco under Biden, if they wanted to get humanitarian aid into Gaza, well, they wouldn't have vetoed ceasefire resolutions in the UN Security Council. And they would have, because that's what the humanitarian community was calling for. It was, they need a ceasefire to be able to import and distribute humanitarian aid at the scale required to address the extraordinary humanitarian crisis, man-made crisis due to Israel's blockade of aid. And incidentally, the IPC recently has declared a state of famine in Gaza. It's because of Israel's policy of utilizing starvation as a weapon of war, which is part and parcel of its genocidal assault on the civilian population. And so this is the nature of the conflict. This is the nature of U.S. support. The U.S. is not a neutral mediator in the conflict, never has been. And of course, Trump has made that obvious. But other presidents, Obama, Biden, they all tried to at least pretend and to feign some level of like objectivity and neutrality, even though it was transparently false that they were in any way neutral. But they would at least have rhetoric about that, about like supporting the two-state solution and all this. But of course, the whole U.S.-led so-called peace process was always the means by which Israel and its superpower benefactor blocked implementation of the two-state solution. So the U.S. has been complicit in that as well. It was never the peace process was never aimed at implementing the two-state solution, because what the two-state solution is a plan that was premised on the applicability of international law to the conflict. And what the peace process was premised on was a rejection of the applicability of international law to the conflict. And there's this deception regarding UN Resolution 242, passed in the wake of the 1967 war, which is what one of the legal foundations for the two-state solution, calling on Israel to withdraw to the pre-June 5th, 1967 lines, also known as the 1949 Armistice Lines or the Green Line. And that's a requirement of international law in accordance with the principle that it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. So the Security Council required Israel to withdraw its forces from the West Bank and Gaza Strip, including East Jerusalem. And instead of the peace process being grounded on that resolution, because the U.S. and Israel say that they accepted Resolution 242 as the basis for this peace settlement, under the Oslo Accords, et cetera. But that's just a deception, because Israel has its own unilateral interpretation of that resolution that defies the Security Council's intent, and the U.S. accepts Israel's unilateral interpretation of that resolution as the framework for the peace process. And so, under the peace process, you have essentially this demand that the Palestinians must negotiate with their oppressors over how much of their own land they can continue living in, and maybe someday exercising some kind of limited autonomy over. That's the peace process. That's not the two-state solution. The two-state solution and the peace process are anathema to each other. They're in direct contradiction to each other. So that was always a big deception, that the peace process was aimed at a two-state solution. And the media have been complicit in this, as always. And so this is the problem that I always like to say, forget what you think you know about the Israel-Palestine conflict, because most of what Americans think they know is completely false. It's wrong. They believe in myths and propaganda, and they have no idea the true nature of the conflict.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree with you more about that. Next up, I have a clip of Betzel Smotrich, and what he's discussing here is settlement expansion in the West Bank, and this is also AI-generated translation.
A form that is not perfect for both sides. Anyone today in the world who tries to recognize a Palestinian state will get an answer from us on the ground. Not in documents, not in decisions or declarations, but in facts. Facts like houses, facts like neighborhoods, roads, and more Jewish families building their lives. They will talk about the false Palestinian dream. We will continue to build a fulfilling Jewish reality. From here, on this important day, I call on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The time has come to fully apply Israeli sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, to forever remove the idea of dividing the land from the agenda, and to make sure that by September, the hypocritical leaders in Europe simply have nothing left to spew.
So Smotrich is talking about this plan from some Western governments, France, the UK, Canada, Australia, to recognize a Palestinian state. And he's saying by September, there won't be a Palestinian state to recognize. And he's saying this as he's discussing a new settlement expansion that Israel has that will bisect the West Bank. Settlement expansion seems to be a pretty important part of Israel's strategy for taking control of the West Bank. So I'm just wondering, your thoughts on the role of settlement expansion, and is it Israel's overall goal to make the situation uninhabitable for the Palestinians in the West Bank?
Yeah, accompanying the genocide in Gaza has been extreme violence in the West Bank as well, more ethnic cleansing continuing there as well. IDF protecting settlers who are violent, destroying Palestinian property, taking over Palestinian land. They just act with complete impunity, and Israel has always acted with impunity in the West Bank. And this is one of the reasons I titled my book "Obstacle to Peace." It's kind of a play on two descriptions. One was describing, the U.S. description of Arafat and the Palestinian leadership as an obstacle to peace, and secondly, the U.S. description of the settlements as an obstacle to peace, as though the U.S. was opposed to the settlements. And again, this is just kind of meaningless rhetoric, because if you look at the actions, the U.S. has always been absolutely complicit in the settlement and occupation regime and supporting it, notwithstanding meaningless rhetoric to the contrary. And so, yes, the goal is to take over the West Bank. In fact, Netanyahu has essentially continued Sharon's what was called the disengagement plan, where you often hear this claim that, Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, as though Israel didn't remain the occupying power under international law in Gaza by virtue of its control over Gaza's land crossings, over the crossings on the so-called borders, what's really an armistice line still, its territorial control over its territorial waters, its airspace, and continued administrative control over the Strip. And of course, Gaza has been called rightly head of Israel's National Security Council, Giora Island, in 2004, before the blockade was escalated in 2006, 2007, after Hamas won legislative elections, called it a huge concentration camp. And that's essentially how Netanyahu has viewed it. And so his view is kind of that, Hamas was contained within the concentration camp. They did withdraw. The Sharon's idea with the disengagement plan was to gain political cover, withdrawing soldiers and settlers from Gaza in order to shift resources into taking over more of the West Bank. That was always the goal there. And Netanyahu has continued that. That was his effective strategy that tied right into his policy of utilizing Hamas as a strategic ally. He needed a divide in the leadership, in the Palestinian leadership, with the PA, Palestinian Authority, continuing under Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank to rule there, and Abbas's term expired in 2009, and with Hamas ruling in Gaza. And so this division of the leadership has prevented a unified Palestinian solidarity leadership that might be more effective in advancing the two-state solution and its goals under international law and with solidarity with the international community. And so it's a divide and conquer strategy. And the goal has always been to take over more of the West Bank. And here, explicit calls for annexing the West Bank, the separation barrier that Israel has built in the West Bank, which, in 2004, I believe it was 2004, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, ruled was a violation of international law. It was an annexation wall. They strategically placed it around the major settlement blocks to effectively annex those settlements. And this has always been the strategy, is just to kind of continually to take more of the Palestinians' land and essentially and effectively annex it. And so, the pretenses to the contrary, and again, coming from the U.S. government and the mainstream media, is just more deception.
Well, yeah, I agree with you. A lot of deception going on here. Now, next up, I do want to shift the discussion to Gaza, where we have high ranking Israeli officials. This is, I believe, a Brigadier General Alfie Defrin talking about destroying the Gaza Strip.
We
will deepen the damage to Hamas in Gaza City, a stronghold of governmental and military terror of the terrorist organization. We will deepen the damage to the terror infrastructure above and below the ground and sever the population's dependence on Hamas.
So I know it's always hard to speculate what Israel is going to do, but it seems that Israel does have a clear goal here of territorial expansion and conquest. And so what is the plan for the Palestinians that will no longer have homes, churches, schools, or any other infrastructure in Gaza once the destruction of Gaza City is complete?
Well, according to Netanyahu, the plan is to complete the military conquest of northern Gaza, and to complete the ethnic cleansing of northern Gaza, and to expel the inhabitants of Gaza City who remain. And they're being given a choice. They can either flee south, or they can stay and be starved to death. I mean, so it's essentially, they're being given a choice between ethnic cleansing or genocide. And this is, of course, fully supported by the Trump administration. When Trump came into office, the day before his inauguration, a ceasefire was implemented between Hamas and Israel. Hamas honored the ceasefire agreement. Israel, with Trump's support and encouragement, violated it. In fact, Trump was explicitly suggesting to Israel publicly that they ought to, instead of honoring the agreement, instead of upholding its obligations under that ceasefire agreement, to just issue Hamas an ultimatum to release all remaining prisoners without upholding its obligations to withdraw from Gaza, to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid, 600 trucks a day of humanitarian aid. And Israel did not uphold its end of the agreement, violated it, and then with Trump's explicit encouragement, violated the ceasefire, implemented a total siege on March 2nd, and then on March 18th, renewed its genocidal assault on the Strip. So this was with the explicit support and encouragement of the Trump administration, and of course Trump had advocated, the Riviera of the Middle East. Like, he literally explicitly advocated ethnically cleansing Gaza. And so this is the plan, and of course, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and the likes of the extremist settler community, the religious settler community in Israel that Netanyahu's Likud party basically is allied with and pretty much represents now. This is what they've been calling for. They have been explicitly calling for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And if Palestinians aren't agreeable about leaving, that they can just stay and die. They can starve to death or be killed in the indiscriminate bombardment. And Netanyahu only differs from them, not on like whether the ethnic cleansing should occur. He's just a little bit more pragmatic about like asking questions like, well, where would they go? Like, that's the difference between, like the Smotrich and Ben-Gvir types and like Netanyahu. It's these marginal differences where Netanyahu is a little bit more practical in terms of like political realities of finding a country that would accept Palestinian refugees. And since nobody's willing to accept them, it's kind of like, well, so we're just going to continue this extermination campaign and starve them to death. And famine has now been declared officially in Gaza.
Yeah, the absolutely horrific, Jeremy. What you're describing there. Now, I do want to ask you. We recently heard Netanyahu talk about supporting the vision of a greater Israel, and it certainly seems that there's now a widespread consensus in the Israeli government that that is certainly going to include Gaza and the West Bank. But when other people talk about greater Israel, the map stretches, from the Nile River Valley all the way to the Persian Gulf, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, parts of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, all are a part of what some people have like this religious interpretation of Israel of. So, stretching the borders to Iraq seems a little bit absurd. But what about southern Lebanon, southern Syria, the East Bank? What do you think? How ambitious is Netanyahu?
Well, you have those two classes of Zionists going back to the days of Ben Gurion and Israel's founding through ethnic cleansing, and the terrorist organizations, the Jewish terrorist organizations that were involved in trying to expel the British forces, and the ethnic cleansing campaign that was how Israel was created. And you had like the Jabotinsky extremists who viewed Greater Eretz Israel, Greater Israel as they called it, as extending to the East Bank, like extending into Jordan and so on. And it wasn't just limited to west of the Jordan River. And Menachem Begin is essentially a continuation of that line of thinking, and the Likud party is a continuation of that line of thinking. And so when Netanyahu talks about a greater Israel, minimally, he's referring to a complete takeover of all the land between the river and the sea. I mean, that was in Likud's original charter. Like literally, they were calling for controlling all of the land between the river and the sea. I mean, you hear, people could say that, well, this is when Palestinians call for from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and this is supposed to be some kind of anti-Semitic genocidal slogan. Well, if anything, that slogan was plagiarized from the original Likud charter, and so that's minimally, and then of course you have Zionists who view Eretz Israel as extending to the East Bank. Like you said, parts of southern Lebanon, of course, the Golan Heights that Israel has been occupying since 1967. They've extended their control into Syria, and they view, many of them do view parts of the East Bank, east of the Jordan River, as belonging to Israel. And so I think again, Netanyahu is a bit more pragmatic, and so it kind of, he tempers his views based on what's politically feasible. Whereas some of these people they don't care what's politically feasible. They're just advocating what they want, and that's it. And they're just absolutely extreme in that sense. Whereas I think Netanyahu probably recognized that, it's not going to be from the Euphrates or something, or into, up to the Iraqi border. But I think certainly attempts to take over land, of course, southern Lebanon and in Syria, that will continue. I'm quite certain you'll see continuing efforts to just control the land, not necessarily to annex it like it's trying to do in, East Jerusalem, of course, and also in the West Bank, effective annexation in the West Bank. And East Jerusalem's annexation measures, of course, have been declared repeatedly by a dozen or more UN Security Council resolutions over the years, declared illegal, null and void, because, of course, East Jerusalem under international law remains occupied Palestinian territory. But this is the plan. I mean, it's just absolute conquest and takeover of the land. And the problem from the beginning is that there was an indigenous population of Arabs, the Palestinians, the Arab Palestinians, of course, Jews. There was an indigenous population of Jews as well, a small population, during the Mandate era, who were also considered Palestinians because that's where they lived. And so there were Jewish and Arab Palestinians. So you can read the, like the Peel Commission report, and refers to both as Palestinians. But of course, the problem is you had the Zionists and the influx of immigrants from Europe and elsewhere under the Zionist settler colonial project, backed by British guns to reconstitute Palestine into a demographically Jewish state. And so hence the ethnic cleansing, as Benny Morris put it, without the expulsion of 700,000 Palestinians, a Jewish state couldn't have come into existence. Therefore, it was necessary to expel them. And so they're just trying to complete the job that was started in 1948. That's what this genocide is all about. They're trying to finish the job.
So before we wrap up here, I want to ask you about American support for Israel. And I have this clip of Benjamin Netanyahu on the Trigonometry podcast discussing Israel's position and image in the United States. Let's play this clip.
Because what you're saying, and look, I have a sympathy with what you're saying. Of course I do. But when you say that this is just noise, I would strongly push back against that, Prime Minister, because if you look at particularly Gen Z and the younger generation's opinions and view on Israel, they are, to put it mildly, Prime Minister, deeply unfavorable. And those kids now, they are going to be the next ones to go into politics. They're going to be the next decision makers. That must present you with a very real worry that Israel will not enjoy the same level of support, particularly from the US, that it has once done when those kids come to be the decision makers.
Well, ask them in Britain and ask them in the US what they think of Britain and the US. What do they think? And what are they saying? There's a big campaign, and it's organized and systemic and it's financed to tear away traditional elements of support from Israel. It's not just happening by itself. A lot of it is organized. And if it's organized, you can counter it too at the appropriate time. You just have to concentrate your attention to it. And I agree with you that it's an important point. And I'll tell you what they're saying. They're saying, for example, those in America are saying, we're pro-American. You're pro-American? And you attack Israel that is fighting the people who tried to assassinate President Trump twice, not once, who bombed American embassies, who murdered 241 American Marines in Beirut, who murdered and wounded thousands of Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan with Iranian IEDs, Iran that chants death to America, death to the traitors, to the heathen, and so on. This is the people you support, and in fact, that's where the support. Not only that, you heard some other outlandish things that they do. I mean, they're some of their most prominent spokesmen. They say, well, Netanyahu is trying to drag Trump into a war. Did you hear that? You hear that one?
So Jeremy, I thought it was worth playing the whole clip. I know we could probably spend an hour debunking all the lies that Netanyahu told right there, but I think I see a little bit of him being nervous, trying to spin all these different lies up to convince the American people to keep supporting Israel. I know you mentioned earlier in the show that Donald Trump or Joe Biden could have told Netanyahu to stop it at any time. And so with the dwindling support for Israel in the United States, I think the gap between Israel favorability and Palestinian favorability is the smallest it's ever been in multiple polls at this point in time. What happens here? Do the American people have a say? Can we control our foreign policy and get Washington to stop supporting Tel Aviv, or do you think it's just not going to matter in this special relationship between U.S. and Israel, and all the U.S. support that's already being built up for Israel is just going to keep dominating, and we will help them complete the genocide in Gaza?
I think we, the American people, have the power to end it. And we're the only ones who can. No government in the world is going to get it done and accomplish peace in the Middle East. It's up to us. And what it requires is we need to affect the paradigm shift required to make it politically infeasible for the U.S. policy of continuing its support for Israel's crimes against the Palestinians to continue. And so, there are positive developments, as they were just describing, how public opinion is shifting. And of course, Israel's genocide in Gaza is affecting that and pushing that along, which is, a silver lining of the horror. That people are starting to awaken, as I like to put it, the thin veil has been lifted and the true face of modern political Zionism is revealed. And people can now see what it's always been about. That they can see the absolute fanaticism and extremism they can see how Israeli society has become absolutely genocidal. And there are protests, there are major protests against Netanyahu in Israel, but it's not because they're anti-genocide by and large. And there are segments of Israeli society who are against the genocide. B'Tselem just came out with a report concluding that Israel is perpetrating genocide. Physicians for Human Rights Israel, right around the same time, recently came out with a similar report concluding the same, that Israel is perpetrating genocide. There are people in Israel who do oppose it. They're pretty marginal. And by and large, as polls show, public opinion polls that have been happening, the most recent one I know of, published in Haaretz, showed, I forget the proportions, but it just, I think like nearly half of Israelis, I think it was 40%, who actually favor complete extermination of the residents of cities in Gaza. So Gaza City, Khan Yunis, the cities in Gaza. It wasn't like the whole of the territory, but it was specifically asking about like the cities in Gaza. Should the populations be exterminated? And the polls showed that a huge proportion of Israelis believe that should happen. A larger proportion believe that Gaza should be ethnically cleansed. Again, the numbers are escaping me off the top of my head, and I have to look them up. But again, a considerable proportion of the Israeli population additionally thought that the Arab citizens of Israel should be expelled as well. So by and large, and those who don't favor outright extermination and ethnic cleansing are not opposed to the genocide for moral reasons or for humanitarian reasons. It's just that they oppose Netanyahu because Netanyahu has blocked the ceasefire, and so this includes families of hostages, and they want the hostages released, and so they just oppose Netanyahu because Netanyahu is not prioritizing the hostages, and so we need to understand that about Israeli society, and I think I think Americans are kind of waking up, but we're not nearly to the point yet with awareness. You still have Christian Zionism is a huge problem that needs to be confronted in the United States. You have congresspersons who are extreme Christian Zionists. You have the whole issue with the red heifers, and they're trying to obtain red heifers, and to do the sacrifice to be able to cleanse. That there's a purification ritual that needs to be done so that Jews can return to the Temple Mount and destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque and rebuild the Jewish temple. And I mean, there are Congress people who share this ideology, like this extreme Christian Zionism, to like usher in the return of Yeshua Mashiach, that Jesus the Christ. And so there are Christian Zionists in America trying to help Israeli extremists in Israel obtain red heifers to be able to do this sacrificial work. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, these people literally want Armageddon to happen. Like they're really trying to usher in Armageddon. So that's a whole huge elephant in the room that needs to be addressed. But by and large, I just want to repeat that. Yeah, I believe that we have the power to change things. We need to stand up and speak out and just make it politically infeasible for the government that claims to represent us to continue these horrific criminal policies and support for crimes against humanity, including ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and now genocide.
Absolutely. Jeremy, thank you so much for coming on the show today and sharing your absolute wealth of information on this subject with my audience. I really appreciate it. Your book, Obstacle to Peace, is, I want to say, a must read for people who want to have a deep understanding of this subject, to be able to, not only to understand the propaganda of the past, but also see through the propaganda they're going to roll out for you tomorrow, next month, next year, as the U.S. continues to bat the Israeli conquest of Palestine. So, Jeremy, we'll have to do it again. Everybody, check out Jeremy's work. He's a research fellow at the Institute, and your website is jeremyrhammond.com, correct?
Yes, it is. That's right.
All right. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thanks, Kyle.